So, you want to get into historical European martial arts. What shall we do? Hello everyone, I am Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and we're going to look at, considering the fact that it is the whole new year, and usually meaning new year, new me, I figured that there may well be a fair few people who want to get into historical European martial arts, or HEMA for short. So why not have a look into what needs to be done? So I'm going to, in this video, talk about the equipment that would be useful for getting started in such things. So the first thing we're going to talk about is protective equipment. No, I know some of you are going to go, but what about the swords? The swords, we're going to go crazy with some of these. And I'm deliberately choosing, we will not start with the swords, same as you yourself should not start with the swords, because you're going to start making regret purchases, frankly. I'll cover that more in the section. So, for the current section, in terms of protective equipment, to get yourself started, absolute basics, we're looking at 3 different things you're going to need immediately. And when I say immediately, I find that with certain clubs and places you are able to borrow equipment. People have things like a club kit. The place that I had been to, the Iron Door Collective, had various pieces of spare protective equipment, masks and gloves available for people to borrow, and things like the foam and nylon and steel swords so people could do some general drills and also for actual sparring. But in terms of the things you'll need to think about in terms of purchasing for yourself, mask, gloves, groin guard. With the mask, we're looking along the lines of something like a fencing mask. Now, yes, some people may find they're able to do sparring with things like the sort of Society for Creative Anachronism type helmets or reenactment style helmets, but in what is normally done, because of course there are no set rules as such for the general practice, it only starts to get more narrow and specific when you're looking at things like tournaments. But broadly speaking, we're usually looking at a system where, bearing in mind, pretty much the whole body is a target. I've seen in general it tends to be frowned upon to strike down at the feet, and also you're not supposed to deliberately strike the groin. And yes, I did just gesture towards my groin with a sharp axe I made. We're going to gloss over that. But the thing is, the reason why I would not recommend looking at things like some of the, especially reenactment helmets, the sort of thing I'm wearing now, you might notice that you've got exposure, so the eyes are exposed. This is a potential danger, even with cuts, but also very frequently of thrusts. You've got openings where you could lose an eye in the middle of sparring. Let's not do that. And in terms of cuts, any sort of cut under or sideways, coming towards or even forwards, particularly if you've got a shorter opponent against a taller opponent, where blows are not so much coming down but more forwards in that action. Some sort of opening and exposure in the face is not going to be suitable for that type of sparring, because in things like some of the reenactment and LARP and other things, they usually have a lot more restrictions on where you're allowed to hit, and that usually accommodates for the fact that people are wearing things like open face helmets or perhaps no helmets. But in HEMA, we are looking at the whole body being a target pretty much, and you need to be prepared for that. So we're more looking along the lines of, and I wouldn't recommend some of the broad grills that you get in some of the Society for Creative Anachronism types of helmets, because they tend to have larger gaps, which are, well, they're quite good with those thick bars against cuts, absolutely great. But in terms of thrusts, very easy openings where, again, someone could lose an eye or something like that, or could get teeth knocked out. So something more along the lines of a fencing mask. Now, the ones that are used for things like Olympic fencing can be suitable up to a point. You do need to bear in mind that sometimes the bibs are quite thin and don't provide much protection for the neck, so you might want to get something like a gorget or some sort of fencing jacket with some sort of blade catcher, even for the lighter types of sparring, if you've got one of those very thin types of helmets for things like sabre épée foil in Olympic style. But the sorts of things that you get for historical European martial arts, like for example I think they're called PBT type fencing masks, or the Red Dragon ones. There are various brands available. Ones with a decent bib, reasonable mesh, just in general, those sorts of things are suitable. In terms of gloves, it depends on the type of sparring that you're doing, but for the basic stuff I'd recommend along the lines of those sorts of dedicated historical European martial arts gloves and gauntlets. Things like lacrosse gloves can be good. Cricket gloves can be okay, apart from the fact they tend to have one hand not having a covered thumb properly. If you're doing lighter sparring with more like the sort of foam or nylon types of weapons, usually any sort of protective gloves, even from the likes of gardening gloves, that will give a bit of padding to your hands, will be sufficient. But when you get up to things like steel sparring, this is where you need to look at more like the mitten type gauntlets that will really give you proper solid protection to your hand. And at that point, some of the things like the sort of even things that supposedly are good for combat, like riot gloves, are actually no longer suitable. And in terms of groin guard, pretty self-explanatory. Something like a cricket box or those sort of jockstrap type things they're used for various types of martial arts. Something that will protect the groin. I will mention that I would not recommend the sort of loose groin guards. They tend to slip around the leg and they start coming free in the middle of sparring. I noticed this with a cricket box I had. It kept trying to come free and I had to stop and reset. So I had one that was actually strapped and attached. I wear under the trousers and that just stays in place. You don't need any special brands. As long as it's a sturdy, reasonable groin guard, most anything is suitable at that point, in my opinion. Now, in terms of heavier sorts of protective gear, once you start looking at the more heftier sparring, heading towards the sort of tournaments and things like that, at that point, you need full protective gear. That's right, kiddos, we're going to pad ourselves out like the Michelin tyres guy. So in terms of the things that you would need when you're getting more up towards tournament level, or you're doing full-on sparring with steel swords, I mentioned about the masks. You will also require, in many cases, a gorget, which is that sort of protective collar and bib, and a fencing jacket. Now in terms of fencing jacket, you'll find ones which will tell you they're designed for certain things. When you're doing something more along the lines of sort of small sword or rapier or something like that, more thrust heavy, you can find some of the thinner types of jackets, the ones that call themselves along the lines of sort of officer jackets or just a thinner jackety types of things that look almost like normal clothing. When it starts heading up towards things like sabre or an arming sword, or getting up towards things like spears and two-handed swords, you need to have the proper padded jackets which are designed and look very much like the historical gambesons. Now, I would recommend, yes, I'm going to self-promote because it is relevant, I did a video specifically about good versus bad gambesons, and it talks about, I will summarise in this video now, basically when you've got things like armpits rather, that can raise enough without lifting the jacket are quite good. If you've got decent thick padding and layers, that's good. If you make sure that the attachment system has some sort of overlap, so if it's something that sort of closes more just together, if there are gaps opening up, that's where it can create exposures. There needs to be some sort of overlap, whatever the attachment system is, from zips all the way down to like leather thonging. And also the good jackets tend to have, by default, a bit of a bend in the elbows. That's how you can tell the difference. If they just look straight like a normal jacket, you'll find that they're very stiff and the material bunches up and gathers if you bring your arms in. It's very uncomfortable. So the ones that start with a slight bend in the elbows when not worn, those designs, of course you're not going to extend your elbows beyond straight unless you're either double jointed or have snapped your arm and you've got other problems to worry about. So having a slight bend inwards means you've got further that you can go, bending the arm inwards for various actions before it starts bunching up material and becoming uncomfortable, for the same general protection. So yeah, thick padding for the heftier weapons, and my general rule is, if you're not sure on what to get, If you get the heavier padding, it might feel stiff at first, but if you can work it in and get used to fighting it, that's fine. I actually use the heavier, long sword as in a two-handed sword type of training for full tournament level, even if I'm just doing casual sparring with something like an arming sword or a saber. I technically don't need that much protection, but if I'm just deciding to start off with a full bit of kit, then having that thick jacket is really going to help, and you basically can't go wrong. Yes, you'll be slightly heavier and slower, but it's something you can get used to, whereas if you've got too light protection, enjoy a hospital trip, or possibly an early death. There we are. Now, other than that, I will also recommend for heavier sorts of stuff, gauntlets. Things like the crab shell types of gauntlets are good. If you've got the full 5-finger gauntlets, the really thick, tough, hard shell types of ones are going to be very important. It's up to you whether you prefer the more clamshell types of things or the more dexterous 5-finger versions. The prices and the levels of protection will vary. Look at reviews, I would recommend, legitimate ones, and ask people in clubs. For lower protection, I would recommend you've got the sorts of pantaloons or breeches which have degrees of protection on the upper legs, and then greaves for the lower legs. There are some people who go, particularly for casual sparring, without the upper leg protection. I've never seen someone get a fracture or anything from being struck in the thighs, but in general I would still recommend that upper leg protection, and there are going to be certain tournaments or club rules where people will be more strict, in which case they'll say no, you need that for that full kit sparring. And the greaves, it's going to be more of a broad recommendation. Make sure you've got the front and degrees of the sides of the legs covered. Make sure that it's pretty sturdy and can take a fairly heavy hit. I've seen people having things like the more sort of football, as in what people in the United States call soccer style greaves that are worn underneath socks. Those have done fine in certain circumstances, as in against things like military saber, arming sword, rapier, that type of stuff. And I think they've even used it against longsword. I personally use the Red Dragon. There's more sort of full out, exterior greaves with some articulation and covering. Make sure whatever combinations you're having between the lower leg and upper leg protection, either separately or as part of the existing kit, make sure the knees are covered. That's an important detail as well. Sometimes that needs to be purchased as a separate cup, or it's just something that is integrated into the other aspects of the protection. And then beyond that, sometimes they recommend a plastron, which is like a hard shell type of protective kit. In fact, I've noticed that when I say plastron in Olympic fencing, I'm talking about a different piece of kit. But I'm talking about the piece of kit that's, I forgot what they call it, but basically usually a hard plate that is worn under jackets usually. I personally actually recommend protection over the jackets, but a lot of people in tournaments wear under jackets. But if you're up against something very thrust-centric, particularly if you're worried about stiff blades, so rapiers, small swords, or if you're expecting someone to go really hefty with those thrusts with something like a two-handed sword or an arming sword or anything, they're not always necessary, but they're often strongly recommended for those types of stiff thrusts, just to make sure that you're not going to crack a rib. But I personally don't wear one. I've actually designed some copper plates I wear underneath it's sort of inside the lining of my fencing jacket, and that helps as well. But I don't really do stuff like rapier and small sword, and certainly not at tournament level, so I usually go without and rely on the thick protection of my Spez Hussar jacket. So that shall be enough on the protective gear. Let's talk about, yes, we can talk about it now, swords. Yes, I know, yeah, we're all wanting to talk about these swords. So, in terms of the sorts of things that are recommended for sparring, blades that are fairly well rated in terms of things like flexibility, and that's for two reasons. One, when a hit happens, you're going to have the blade take some sort of shock. Even if to the human eye it looks like a blade has remained fairly stiff and solid during a hit, by the time you get to some sort of sword length, even the shorter sort of one-handed swords along the lines of Messer and Falchion type of fencing, there is still going to be some flex after a hit. And notice this sword is flex-tempered. Very important. Swords that are too stiff will often be quite brittle and will snap, which is very dangerous, and also just bad for having swords that last. But also, you need to have a degree of flexibility. I don't know if it will be easy to show on video, but a degree of flexibility in the thrust. So this one is a bit stiff. This particular sword is only one that I use for sort of drilling and for sort of teaching because it's a cool looking sword, but I have a different sword that I use for sparring in two-handed swords because it's a more flexible blade and is more suitable. So yeah, with enough flexibility, the blade is able to basically start to absorb the hit, whereas a stiffer blade, even if it's not one that doesn't snap very much, is going to cause a lot of injury to your opponent, and you're creating a situation where you could hospitalise them, and in general they're not going to want to spar with you very much, and frankly that sword is probably going to end up gathering dust in your bedroom. So make sure you've got one that's got a good flex temper. Now, another thing that's important, tips. This is actually not a suitable tip for sparring, so notice that's sort of like a spatulated tip, but it is comparatively fairly sharp. It's not actually sharp. I mean, I can do this, I can start to poke into my hand like that, and I'm not taking any injuries. But for sparring purposes, it's still too sharp. Now, my favourite type of design for a tip is a rolled tip, so that's where it actually curls around at the very tip, and that's a good design because basically that will last as long as the sword does. I've also seen rubberized tips. Sometimes they get destroyed during use, but in general, if you're able to keep them and either replace them whenever you need to, just have a couple spare. If you've got some sort of rubberized tip, that will be good for safety. Another version I like to see at times is a spent shell casing. Yes, from things like rifle cartridges. It's more durable than something like a rubberized casing. And usually I haven't used them myself, I presume it doesn't have too much an effect on the balance. But it means you've got a good tip on the sword which is suitable for thrusting attacks, and it means that it's going to be safer for your opponent. Even if, like me, you tend to lean more towards the cutting actions with swords rather than the thrusting actions, it's still going to be important that you've got a good tip on the blade that is not going to potentially injure your opponent during normal training or a tournament. Very important. Now, in terms of the overall weight, this is where things can vary a lot, but usually people like to have something roughly within the sort of historical parameters. It varies wildly between clubs, it can vary to some extent between tournaments, and it will definitely vary between clubs, which is why I cannot really give you anything too specific on that. But I will say, talk to the people who are going to the places that you're thinking of going to, and look at what sorts of weights and balances of swords they find acceptable, what they find work in terms of good quality fighting, and also the sorts of things that are not going to cause too much injury, while still giving a realistic enough expression of how a historical weapon would have functioned, rather than things like, the Olympic types of weapons which feel like car antennae. So yeah, that's going to be more something to gauge, and I cannot give so easily in numbers. Beyond that, obviously gauge to what sorts of styles, one, you'd like to do, hey, and two, you're actually going to get to do. As great as it may be, you might look at something like the Three Musketeers and think, I'd like something like a rapier or a small sword. But you know what, buddy? If you're going to clubs and tournaments in your area and it turns out nobody does that, you could indeed try to kind of be a bit of a trend starter and a bit of a trend setter, where you're going to get other people into it. But to begin with, when you're first getting into historical European martial arts, I'd say have a look along the lines of what people are actually practicing in the places that you go, and look into purchasing those sorts of weapons so that you can, I wouldn't want to say fit in, because that sounds wrong. It's more along the lines of just having something that will be suitable to continue training with people, and then of course you can look at trying to introduce the extra flavours of things you might be interested in later on. From my personal experience, when you're practicing with people, if you're first getting into certain things, like usually long swords and these two-handed blades tend to be very wildly popular, And then there are people who say, well, I'd like to try a bit of this, and I'd like to try a bit of that, and people kind of expand and diversify, and you get other people who get into the idea. And when they listen to you, and you're telling them what you're interested in, which is an important thing, telling them the sorts of things you'd like to experience, that will help them to try and think, oh, actually, I'm not just going to buy something like a small sword, and I'm going to be completely on my own, no one's going to want to practice with me. I already know this person also wants to try it out, so it might be worth talking with them, and yeah, you can get the ball rolling. It's much easier that way. But for starters, usually pick the types of weapons that are being trained by everyone else, so you can at least get a grounding in general combat principles, learning the things that these people actually know how to teach, and then once you've got a foothold, then you can start looking at diversifying out of it. So that covers the weapons. Now, in terms of locations, now this will vary between countries, but you've usually got things like, I remember there was some sort of HEMA, I think it was called the HEMA Club Finder. That is one that can help you see, it's not perfect, but it won't have every club in every area everywhere, but you can get some idea of clubs in local areas. I find that if you do internet searching and you're looking for historical European martial arts, or you're looking for sword fighting or terms like that, and you try to look up, things like your immediate local area, or maybe something like a nearest city, or the county, or that sort of geographic region that you're in. But another thing you can do is you can look at certain things like social media groups. You've got places like Facebook, Twitter, X, Discord, the various places. And if you get in amongst those groups on various types of social media, it will vary for you, but there are many different options. But specifically look for the historical European martial arts groups. It might sound like a far-fetched kind of shot in the dark type of thing, but actually if you start asking, okay, just join up and you say, okay, I want to get started, I live in this area, can anybody tell me what clubs are in there? There are people who, even if they personally don't know of any clubs, they've got contacts, they've got people they can communicate with, they can say, hey, you're in this local area, do you know of anybody who can help you in this area? And just in general, if you get talking to people who are in these spheres, in those social media groups, they will help you, even if broad online searching is not helping you and they don't have much of an online presence. There will be people who know people if you contact broadly on social media and you just ask, just straight up, I'm from this sort of area, or maybe I'm going to college in this area, or I'm going to be spending some time for a few months for some reason in this general area. Could you tell me if there are any clubs doing HEMA in that region? Then you actually find a surprising amount of helpful answers you can get from people in those groups. So I would recommend getting talking, learning from people, and also beyond what I'm telling you in this video, things that will help you get started, training materials, videos. Obviously you've got things like my own, but you've also got other people on other forms of social media who will teach you certain things, perhaps specifically about the stuff that you want to learn, or that groups in your area will do. These sorts of communications will help you a lot in your journey and make things a lot easier than you realise. And finally, have fun. And you know what? Sometimes you might need to do alternatives. I have personally seen people come into HEMA from other backgrounds, and that is okay, it can still help you. Live action roleplay. People have gained genuine experience doing that. In fact, my nemesis, I'll call him, at Fight Camp, Mark Gilbert, is a guy who does a lot of LARP, and he is just better than me at Sword and Buckler. I know it, it's embarrassing every time, but one of these days I'll beat him, hopefully. But he's clearly got a lot of experience. People who come from things like reenactment backgrounds. Now, reenactment can be more expensive, of course, but people who come from those sorts of backgrounds can be helped in those things. Sport fencing, I've mentioned earlier. Sport fencing does help. There are degrees to which things don't transfer, like if you're doing things along the lines of the épée, foil, sabre. That won't help you with things like passing footwork, where you're changing sides of your body in things like arming sword and longsword or dussac. those sort of things won't help, but things like understanding the shuffle, footwork, advancing and retreating, things like powering a cut not just from the shoulder and the elbow, but also learning how to act with your wrist. This is something I might cover in another video, but that is all. These sorts of things, the skills that you're learning, will be applicable and directly transferable to historical European martial arts. And even things that help in general, more broadly speaking, if you've done things like boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, those sorts of things, if you've gained that sense of distance and timing, even if you're just initially starting with things like your fists and feet, having an understanding of things like footwork, distance, timing, that sort of stuff will help you. So training in those areas and improving your physical fitness as well can help you transition into HEMA, even if there isn't an immediate club in the meantime. And while you're contacting those people I've mentioned earlier, if there isn't a club at all in your area, you may well be able to have the chance to start one. And that's a situation that could well fruit into something that's absolutely great for you. And it may well be a situation where you're having to start very much at the bottom in terms of the actual applicable, direct sword techniques. But that is where I recommend going to things like national and international events. In Britain, we've got Fight Camp and the May Melee, things like the Days of the Blade or some name like that, Albion Cup. There are various situations where those sorts of national and international events will help people gain skills which they can then bring back to their local areas, and then if you're starting up a club in that sort of area, then you can transfer the skills. But again, doing other activities in the meantime, like boxing, like sport fencing, like LARP, like reenactment, or just keeping fit in general, or just spending time watching the videos, including my own, that will help. This sort of stuff can help you on your journey. It may not be as fast and you may not grow as quickly as you'd like to, but any progress is better than no progress. So take heart and get the journey started. So in general, I'll say that's pretty much as much as I can advise for now. In terms of things like budgeting, again, that's more something to discuss with local clubs. The more protective equipment you're getting, the more expensive. If you're getting a whole range of weapons and styles and things, that's going to make it more expensive, whereas a very narrow focus on only one style will make it cheaper. That's more something you need to gauge for yourself, and I can't really give as much advice on there without going into very specific details if someone asked me a very specific and narrow focus question, which won't help in this broad video. But I hope that was still informative, and remember, the whole thing about Medieval Genie is that if you have something that's a burning question in your mind to do with these sorts of topics, to do with historical arms and armour, that's what I'm here for. If you want to know more and there's something that you're wanting to ask me, ask it in the comments or on social media where you can find me, and I will be more than happy to look into covering those sorts of topics and granting those wishes in the process. Ta-ra for now.